We'll get cracking. So today in the Maths Network, we're going to be looking specifically at facilitating mathematical language as one of the evidence-informed approaches to support children with their mathematical development. So how do we facilitate mathematical language? What does that look like? I've aimed to put in lots of examples of where this might be happening, how to ensure that we plan for specific mathematical language. We'll look at some evidence. This is an evidence-informed practice, but we will also mention some of the previous ones that we've looked at. And we will keep doing that as we go through with these network meetings each month. What does it look like and how do we do it? So if we look back at our statutory framework, the specific mention of mathematical vocabulary comes in this form. Children will develop a secure base of knowledge and vocabulary from which mastery of mathematics is built. So in that brief phrase, the statutory framework is telling us that alongside getting children really secure in number, we will be having to teach our children specific words that are related to different areas of mathematics. So if we break up our year in, say, 6 strands of mathematics, you may be looking at 4 broad areas. But if you are doing that in a sequential way over your year, you will find that you want to make sure that you are teaching specific words and phrases that are related to each of those strands. So it's about being really methodical so that you are not leaving anything behind. This doesn't mean that you're not going to be using language that happens spontaneously, but it does mean that you will make sure you're not leaving anything out, like shape, space, and measures, for instance, that is not there as an early learning goal. Some people might give it less attention because of that. But we know it's really important that children have really good spatial awareness because that is also something that determines their academic success later. Oh, went a bit too quickly there, sorry. So these are the 5 approaches that have been identified when looking through the educational research related to the earliest mathematics teaching. So we looked in our last network at promoting fluency with numbers and sequences and how that was quite related to teaching the association between number and quantity. And those are areas that we know are really emphasized in the EYFS, and that firm grounding in understanding what numbers represent is really, really important for children's later mathematical development. But what we didn't talk so much about was how specific we need to be with the language that we use and the language that we expect echoed back from the children, so they can express all of their understanding. So this facilitation of mathematical language underpins all of the other approaches. The evidence is strongest when the approach is embedded alongside other approaches. So consider that it's not done in isolation. To have its maximum effect, it needs to be done alongside other approaches. So the advice to educators is to find ways to facilitate mathematical language at the same time as other approaches and activities. And we know that means in a playful, early years specific context with a mixture of adult-led and continuous provision, child-led child facilitated, adult facilitated, a mixture. So if we're looking at the context of block play, this might be in a continuous provision situation. You may see that your children have developed an incredibly huge structure. So it may be the opportune moment to use language like tall, tallest, taller. You might want to use some comparative language. You want to make sure the children understand what tall and short means. You may introduce the idea of height and length being quite different, that generally we measure length horizontally and we measure height vertically. You're going to be using gestures to reinforce what these words mean. So width is shown with your hands outspread, and this structure here lends itself to talking about the width and the height of it. You may choose to be in an outdoor environment and introduce new language and phrases in your outdoor space, where often children are less inhibited, more likely to practice new words. And what you'll do is work from the language you know the children have been exposed to, the language that you know the children are familiar with. So Incy Wincy, for instance, we generally have taught the children how to sing the song Incy Wincy Spider from their earliest years. They may have been exposed to Incy Wincy in their playgroups, for instance, if they've gone along to some stay and plays. So a good place to start, if we're dealing with children who have English as an additional language, absolutely bring in the language that they've been exposed to in song and use those songs to reinforce the language as well. It's a great way to get children interested in hearing the words. You're going to want to build from the more common words like small and big, and then extend to words like little, large. You might then start introducing minute, but you only want to introduce those tier 2 and tier 3 words when you know that all of your children have a really firm grounding in the simplest of words, and you are absolutely sure that there are no misconceptions there. The idea is that we really don't want to leave any child behind, and we don't want to race ahead too quickly so that they don't have that strong foundation. So outside, you might be drawing attention to the tiny little bugs that we can find, the ladybirds, the flies, the little butterflies, and you can use that comparative language quite easily because you've got the larger structures, you've got the trees, you've got the bushes, and they're much, much bigger than the tiniest of the mini beasts and bugs. You might want to be doing things that are really meaningful, that are part of the structure of your year. You may have a garden where you grow things like runner beans, and in the autumn you get to harvest those, and you then get to collect the seeds for your spring planting. So this is a really important task that you're doing in collaboration with the children so that you have your spring planting seeds. You might want to organize them in packets of 5, and you've got a very precise reason why you need to put 5 in each of the packets, and that way you can reinforce the one-to-one correspondence. That idea of applying maths to real tasks is something that we need to consider to make sure that children are realizing maths is used daily. It's really useful. It helps us organize things and be precise. And in a shop, you need to have the right amount of seeds in the packet that you're selling. Otherwise, the customer is going to be quite angry. So here I've chosen 3 images again that lend themselves to your outdoor environment if you're lucky enough to get out to a park or have a garden on your own site. Things like growing sunflowers is very exciting because again you can collect those seeds for your springtime planting, and you can talk about really large amounts, so large that they can't be counted. You can talk with the children about how you need to be incredibly precise to pick out a certain amount of seeds, again, to fill your packets or to fill a pot. Here we've got children handling worms. Little caution here that worms shouldn't be handled for too long because hands are very, very hot for them. But what a motivator to talk about how many worms they have. Now, the reason I've written here that we could try we need rather than saying, oh, how many have you got there? Often practitioners might say, oh, how many? In a construction activity or when a child has gathered up a little collection of things, and children might be put off by that finite question. Some children will be really excited to count out exactly how many, but some might drop the task. Whereas if we said, it'd be really helpful if you could get 5 worms into the compost bin because we're a bit low on worms. They could be really excited about being really precise and counting in their worms because it's a task that you need doing in your garden space. And I couldn't resist putting in the borage plant here with the blue butterfly that's landed on it. There's so much to spot and there's so much maths in your outdoor spaces when you introduce a bit of biodiversity, have bugs to find, grow plants that attract bees and butterflies. That's very motivational for the children. So if you're talking about quantity, the types of words you want to be using will be words like amount, how many. You want to use amount as well because that is a really precise word that means the quantity, the exact quantity. You also want to teach the children that when you're picking out an exact amount of seeds, you've got to have a stopping number so you remember when to stop putting more seeds in your packet. So if you want to have 6 seeds in your packet, your stopping number is 6. And when do we need to stop? 6. Okay, let's go. And we can make that super playful. You can gauge when the children are ready for that kind of language. But these are the precise types of words and phrases that you really want to expose your children to eventually. Words like exactly and a collection. I have a collection of seeds here. I have a collection of bits of flower. I have a collection of leaves. This is the first step in categorizing. And a collection is an easier word to say than a categorizing. Amounts, if you're reinforcing those, the types of activities you may have and put out in your continuous provision will allow children to collect specific amounts. The Numicon's really helpful for this because you've got the little circles that you can place exact amounts of conkers on, or marbles, or maybe even acorns. And the inclusion of something like the dough lends itself to making small balls that can also be collected. On the other side, you've got the shells where you can see how many you can get into a shell, or you can play around with the different sizes of the amounts of pearls that you're putting into your shells. But what's important is that you make it motivational. I know sometimes people say, oh, we have a maths area, we put out all of this mathematical stuff, but it's not being used mathematically. In which case you need to think about how can I set something up in a way that it's really fiddly and fun to use, but the things I've put there lend themselves to counting out specific amounts. So that's the language I can then reinforce. If you're reinforcing amounts with younger children, a good way to do this and focus on smaller quantities is to have bigger resources. So this is an example of really nice big sensory balls that are being placed in a really large pneumacons. In your small world play or your loose parts play, you may be making arrangements of things. With loose parts especially, you could be making works of art, you could be making transient art. Here the children have made some very simple faces on little cork boards, and that's where you could, as the practitioner, add in some language that is relational to help the children understand the spatial relationship between the objects they've placed there. So it could be that you talk about the eyes being really wide apart or close together, or the nose being in the middle, and to see whether your children are understanding these words, you could give some simple instructions. Oh, let's have a look at what the face would look like with the eyes really far apart. And you may notice that they don't really move them, or they might put them closer together, in which case you can then say really far apart and show them with your hands so that you're reinforcing what that means. And that will help them understand that new language. The research also looks a lot at the use of texts in the teaching of mathematical language, and it's been seen to really have a positive effect on children acquiring those new words and phrases that they can then apply to the concepts. So you've got 10 black dots here, which is really useful for reinforcing what a quantity is, up to 10. So you can make that correspondence between the numeral and its amount. It helps reinforce the reading of the numerals, and it also can help reinforce counting in a slightly more abstract way, because those dots are not movable objects. Obviously, with all the counting that you do, you need to make sure that your first steps are with real objects. The next stage is to point at pictures or images. You've got balancing act, which is a lovely story that can reinforce the notion of weight. You might want to be reinforcing heavier and lighter. You've got Dear Zoo, where you could then set that up in the continuous provision and have animals of different sizes and organize those animals in order of their size. So lots of size language being used. And then you've got Kipper's Toy Box, where all of the toys are of different shapes and different lengths and different widths. Again, you can reinforce that language of shape, but also of pattern, because some of them will have patterns on them. And then you've got Sharing a Shell, where you'll be talking about getting into a space, whether it's big enough or if you're a bit too big for it and it's getting too small, then I now need to find a new shell that I can fit inside. So that language of measures. So in the evidence that their Education Endowment Foundation reviewed, they found different practices were used to teach the facilitation of learning mathematical language. And a typical way, it was described in the evidence, involved educators narrating their mathematical observations and reasoning out loud, and encouraging children to explain their own reasoning out loud. So this is a great example of an adult pondering, noticing, and not posing a finite question and expecting an answer that may be right or wrong, but rather talking about what they can see and what they are noticing and working things out loud, encouraging the children to then do the same. So the notion of maths being really investigative is really important, so that children feel like they can be quite experimental with amounts, with arranging amounts in different ways and describing what it is that they see. So this is a very simple video that you find in the evidence store. If you look at the approach 5, facilitating mathematical language, you scroll right down to the bottom and find this lovely video of Vicky, who is joining the play at the clay table with a group of children and reinforcing that language of weight. And she wants to reinforce what heavier means. And so she's using a lot of gesture. She's explaining and showing. She's then naming and labeling, because she realizes there's a bit of a misconception. Not all of the children are aware of what the heaviest is, what heavy means. She's using a lot of exaggerated expression to show that with this heavy lump of clay. And then she imitates a child who uses the correct language to describe the heaviness of the clay for the other children to also be exposed to that language. And it's a really great way to see those very specific little practices of explaining and showing, naming and labeling. Sorry, I went too fast there. And then imitating and reinforcing. Another place that you may find useful is the National Centre of Excellence for the Teaching of Mathematics, where they have these really useful grids. If you're new to the strands of mathematics and you might want to be systematizing how you expose the children to different mathematical concepts over the year, this is a really good place to start, because they show you how children acquire mathematical understanding in the different strands. And from there, you will pull out the language that you know you want your children to really understand. If it's counting backwards, you want to be using the words backwards and forwards. It might be that you want to get the children exposed to the language of measures. How are you going to do that over your half term, over the weeks that you've got? What are the simplest words that you want to expose them to first before building? So if we use pattern as an example, in the strand of pattern, we talked earlier about categorizing and having groups of objects. That's a very first stage to understanding pattern. So you categorize things by type. And you may be talking about having a collection of red things, a collection of blue things. It may be that you open it out to the children and they make their own collections and they need to explain their collection. Ah, this is a collection of shiny things. I have shiny things here. And here I have things made of wood. All of these things are made from wood. So they're getting aware of how to categorize things in different ways. And once they do categorize, they can create a repeated pattern. It may be that you want children to spot random patterns like stripes or dots, or the different patterns you get in wallpaper and in clothing. Or it may be that you want them to start making their own repeated patterns, in which case, by the end of your block of talking about pattern, you will really hope that the children can explain to you what their pattern is. And they might say, this is my repeated pattern. And you'll say, oh, what type of repeated pattern is it? And you'll hope that they'll get to the stage where they can say, this is a blue-red pattern. It's a blue-red pattern because it goes blue-red, blue-red, blue-red again and again. So only if you've introduced that language of again and again, a repeated pattern, the repeated bit or element, then will they be able to use that language and apply it to explaining their own patterns. Obviously, it all starts with the very youngest children. We have some children who've got gaps. Some of us have the pleasure of working with the babies. If we're not working with the babies, we may recognize that some of our children haven't been exposed to the language of up, 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 down, down, down. And that's where they are developmentally. So we need to make sure we're using that language in and out. There are lots of rhymes that are used in play groups and in stay and plays that involve up, up, down, down, open, shut them, open, shut them. Also, the very easy to spot regular shapes like the circle, the square, and the regular triangle are going to be the first ones that we want our children to spot and start naming. The earlier we've exposed our children to these words, the more familiar they'll be, and the more likely they'll be able to use them accurately. We might be using the language of near and of far. We might be making collections of things like buttons or of natural objects that we find outside. And once we've done that, we can create those patterns. But really lovely to open it up to the children. When you have a collection like these buttons, ask them how it is that they want to organize them. You may find one of the children makes a really intricate, long line of buttons from the tiniest to the largest, and they're really paying attention to the different sizes because these are not a uniform bunch of buttons. They're all quite different. And within that difference, there can be quite a lot of opportunity to develop language, especially comparative language. What do you see is a great phrase to use to open it up, to see how it is that your children are learning, how it is that they're seeing things. You would want to be introducing the language of arrangement, one side, the other side. You might start introducing left and right at some point, really tricky to work out. All together, empty spaces. These are all words that we cannot assume children understand. We have to go through playing games with them to work out how proficient they are in understanding these words. Because maths is all about being really precise. It's not left to interpretation. It is about precision. And that's why we need to be precise with our language. So here we might have a child checking to see if 6 have been placed in the bowl that is on the 6th numeral. And you're going to remind them that the stopping number is 6. Much easier stage is when you plop the objects into the bowl. Very easy to reinforce that one-to-one correspondence and that accuracy. And next stage would be to move the objects that are already in the bowl to check how many there are. Actually, the next stage would be to take them out and check that way. If you're keeping them in the bowl, they're just moving them slightly. And that's a much, much trickier skill because it involves a lot of fine motor skill, coordination, as well as counting. So lots going on there. So you can see how you need to break things down and facilitate things at the age and stage that the children are at. So this approach of facilitating mathematical language is backed by evidence and should be used alongside other approaches to have maximum impact. Planning your language intentionally, books, and your interactions all play their part in facilitating mathematical language. So a good thing for you to do in your own space, your own setting, is to think about how do you plan over the year to ensure that mathematical language is broad and looking at all the different strands. How do you choose books that reinforce the language that you'd really like the children to learn? How do you incorporate mathematical language into your routine? A lot of the research looked at mathematical language being embedded into routines and that having a huge impact because of the regularity of using this language. And also consider your interactions. Are your interactions focused on things like understanding the world or maybe creative areas or very heavily based on story? Or is there space for you to use a bit more mathematical language in your interactions? These are useful things to consider. We've written a little explainer, which you can find on